Why some missing persons cases must remain unsolved. In certain remote jurisdictions, a specific cluster of incident report markers, the location, the time of day, the strange silence from witnesses, can trigger a quiet stand-down of all search and rescue operations. This isn't a bureaucratic failure, it is the most critical protocol we have, an unofficial doctrine designed to prevent a localized disappearance from becoming a regional contagion. A review of decades of internal field notes and boundary maps shows why some cases must remain open, serving not as a record of the lost, but as a warning for the living. The oath you take, whether as a park ranger, a sheriff's deputy, or a volunteer with search and rescue, is simple and absolute: you bring the lost home. Every procedure in the book, from establishing a last known point to cutting a grid, is built on this public mandate. Families give you their trust, the media holds you accountable, and the entire weight of your agency is geared toward resolution and closure. You operate on the principle that every person is findable, that the wilderness is merely a difficult variable, not an active participant. This is the official ledger, the one filled with incident reports, dispatch logs, and press releases, and for 99% of cases, it is the only one that matters. But for a select few, you learn early on that the official map is not the true territory. You learn that another book exists, not one issued by the state, but one passed down from a retiring warden to their replacement, its pages worn thin and marked with annotations that would make no sense to an outsider. This is the warden's ledger, and it operates on a completely different premise: that some individuals have not simply become lost in our jurisdiction, but have crossed into another. The decision to move a name from the public search roster to this private record is never made lightly. It follows the appearance of specific, subtle signatures in the initial report: a hiker vanishing from the middle of a clear trail between two companions, a car found locked from the inside at a trailhead with no tracks leading away, or a disappearance occurring in a place the old-timers simply call a bad holler. When these markers appear, the public search continues, of course, with all the expected diligence and resources. But the internal objective shifts from recovery to containment. The official protocol is followed for the public's sake, but the unofficial one, the one guided by the grim notations in that second ledger, is for the safety of the rescuers. It recognizes that pressing the search past a certain geographical or temporal boundary does not increase the probability of detection. It only increases the number of victims. The Wardeness Ledger is a map of these boundaries, a catalog of appeasements, and a quiet acknowledgement that some disappearances serve as a warning that a line has been crossed. For experienced wilderness professionals, the shift from a search and rescue mission to a containment protocol is triggered not by a lack of evidence, but by the presence of very specific, illogical markers in an incident report. The first sign is never dramatic. It's a quiet inconsistency in the incident report that makes the back of your neck prickle, a detail that feels less like a clue and more like a carefully placed error in the fabric of the world. Perhaps a trained outdoorsman with a GPS is reported missing, and his point last seen is a calm, open meadow, yet a single boot is found 10 miles away across an impassable gorge, with no explanation for the transit. Or multiple, otherwise reliable witnesses, separated and interviewed independently, all describe the missing person walking into a peculiar patch of fog on a clear day, a fog they all say smelled of wet ozone and old copper. According to a significant body of anecdotal evidence compiled from veteran ranger debriefs, it is this sort of impossible physics, coupled with consistent but nonsensical testimony, that signals a standard SAAR mission must be reevaluated. These are the patterns that defy conventional logic but align perfectly with the unwritten rules passed down from seasoned officers. They tell you that you are no longer looking for a person who is lost, but dealing with a place that has taken them. The search grid, meticulously planned in the command post, suddenly has a hard, invisible border drawn on it, a line dictated not by topography but by institutional memory. The old-timers will point to a specific creek bed or a ridge of strangely silent woods and say, "We sweep up to there and no further." To an outsider, it looks like giving up. To those who know the pattern, It is the beginning of the real work, a quiet, solemn ritual designed not to find the missing, but to ensure the anomaly remains appeased and does not expand its reach. The public-facing operation continues with its helicopters and ground pounders, but the core objective has shifted from recovery to reinforcing a fragile truce with a phenomenon that has held that territory long before any park was chartered. The shift from a search mission to a containment ritual is triggered by recurring illogical patterns in witness statements and physical evidence that defy the laws of physics but match historical incident reports from specific locations. The modern demand for absolute transparency is a doctrine forged in courtrooms and press briefings, but it shatters against the realities of the deep woods. Out here, we operate under a different, unwritten code that could be termed the doctrine of contained ignorance, a profound ethical framework built on the understanding that some knowledge is not a tool for liberation but a contagion. Releasing the full details of a patterned disappearance, the impossible physics, the environmental signatures, the historical precedents, would not bring closure to a grieving family. Instead, it would detonate a crisis of public confidence on a scale modern emergency management is unprepared to handle, a concept that scholars of mass panic have long understood. First comes the fear, which is predictable, but then comes the far more dangerous second wave, the curiosity. For every 100 people who would flee from a verified hotspot, there is at least one who would be irresistibly drawn to it, convinced they can solve, document, or even harness the phenomenon. This attraction, a well-documented human response to the forbidden and the mysterious, is the primary threat vector. It turns a stable, contained anomaly into an active, agitated one. A quiet understanding maintained by a handful of professionals becomes a public spectacle, and every new visitor with a camera or a misplaced sense of adventure risks resetting the cycle of appeasement that took generations to establish. The official sanitized report attributing the loss to exposure or an animal attack, however unsatisfactory, is not a deception. It is a shield wall, an act of community protection that holds a fragile peace, because the truth doesn't set you free, it just tells everyone else where to find the cage. The primary justification for information control is that public disclosure of anomalous activity invariably attracts individuals who disturb the fragile containment, escalating the threat from a passive state to an active one. Nothing proves the necessity of our unwritten rules more than the yellowing after action reports from incidents where they were ignored. Every few years, a case gets loud enough to draw attention from outside the county line, bringing in a hotshot detective or a federal task force with fresh eyes in a belief that local knowledge is just another word for superstition. They arrive with thermal drones, ground-penetrating radar, and a mandate to close the file, viewing the local warden as quiet warnings about certain ridges or creek beds as incompetence or, worse, a cover-up. We show them the maps, point to the historical patterns, and explain that in this specific holler, you don't push after the first 48 hours, especially not after sundown. They listen with professional condescension, thank us for our folklore, and then proceed to run the most aggressive, technologically advanced search grid the territory has ever seen. The outcome, as documented in a handful of grim internal reviews, is always the same. They do not find the missing person. Instead, something else finds them. Team members report equipment malfunctions in specific, localized pockets. Dogs that were tracking a scent will suddenly whine and refuse to proceed. Searchers on the perimeter will feel a profound, inexplicable sense of being watched, a pressure that has nothing to do with fatigue. Then, inevitably, a new incident occurs. Sometimes it's another disappearance, this time from the search party itself. More often, the effect is broader for months afterward. The hotspot, which had been stable for decades, expands. Incidents start happening in adjacent valleys, places that had always been safe. The cycle, which might have been generational, shortens to years, or even seasons. The outside investigators eventually pull out, frustrated and baffled, leaving behind a colder case file but a far hotter territory. They call it a statistical anomaly, a string of bad luck, but they never see the cause and effect because they don't stay to live with the consequences. They leave us to manage the fragile peace they shattered, a peace that must be reestablished through a long, patient process of appeasement, hoping the entity will eventually settle back into its old boundaries. Internal reviews consistently demonstrate that aggressive protocol-breaching investigations in these areas have never resulted in a successful recovery, but have always led to a measurable escalation of the local threat. Law enforcement is built on the paradigm of conflict and resolution. You identify a threat, you pursue it, and you neutralize it. This model is fundamentally useless when the thing you are facing isn't a perpetrator, but a feature of the landscape, as persistent and impersonal as a lightning strike zone or a flash flood canyon. The entities involved in these specific cases are not criminals to be apprehended, but forces to be managed. You cannot defeat a hurricane. You track its path, board up the windows, and evacuate the population. Our approach is no different. The long-term containment strategies are not about confrontation, but about a deep, almost ecological understanding of the phenomenon-s behavior. We learn its patterns, its seasons, and its boundaries through decades of carefully logged incident reports and anecdotal knowledge from those who have worked the land the longest. Effective appeasement is a quiet, thankless job of maintenance. It means rerouting a popular hiking trail under the guise of erosion control to steer traffic away from a recurring hotspot. It involves establishing unofficial quiet zones where we cease all patrols and activity during certain lunar phases or times of the year that historical data show are active periods. This methodology, which mirrors long-standing practices in managing dangerous natural environments, is the only one that has proven to reduce the frequency of incidents. We are not fighting a war. We are tending a border with something that operates on a timescale far greater than our own, waiting for its cycle to turn and for the pressure along that border to recede. It is a strategy of patience and profound respect for a power we do not seek to control, only to coexist with safely. The only proven method for ensuring long-term public safety in these areas is a containment strategy based on appeasement, which involves monitoring the anti-TS cycles and actively discouraging human access to its territory. The physical dangers of the job are understood, accepted, and trained for you learn to read a river, respect a ridgeline, and handle a grisly encounter. What the Academy can never prepare you for is the profound psychological erosion that comes from carrying unshareable knowledge. The most corrosive part of this duty is not what you see in the Badlands, but the conversation you must have with the family afterward. Looking a mother in the eye and offering the hollow comfort of official procedure when you know, with absolute certainty, that her son didn't just wander off trail. You are forced to perform a ritual of false hope, speaking of search grids and scent dogs, while the truth sits like a cold stone in your gut. This is a specific kind of psychological burden, one that modern trauma counseling is ill-equipped to address. It isn't a simply post-traumatic stress, it is a deeper moral injury, a wound inflicted by being compelled to betray your own professional and personal ethics for a strategic purpose you can never explain. According to the foundational principles of occupational psychology, this sustained conflict between duty and personal morality is a primary driver of burnout and psychic collapse in high-stress professions. Every incident report you file that omits the impossible details, every press briefing where you stick to the sanitized and misleading narrative, is a small act of self-betrayal. Over a career, these acts accumulate, building a wall of isolation around you. You cannot share it with your spouse, your friends, or even most of your colleagues, for fear of being seen as unstable or insane. You become the silent custodian of a truth that warps your perception of the world, unable to look at a peaceful forest without seeing the invisible boundaries in the things that patrol them. This profound loneliness, this dissonance between the world everyone else sees and the one you know to be real, is the true lasting cost of standing the watch. The most significant psychological toll on first responders in these cases stems not from the anomalous encounters themselves, but from the moral injury and intense isolation caused by having to actively deceive victims, families, and the public to maintain containment. The official org chart shows a clean vertical chain of command, but the real work of containment happens horizontally through a web of undocumented alliances that would never appear on a dispatch roster. Jurisdictional boundaries mean little when you're dealing with a threat that doesn't recognize county lines or federal park designations. A park ranger in a national forest might share more operational intelligence over a handshake and a cup of coffee with the neighboring county sheriff than he does in his own formal briefings. This is because the shared language is not one of statutes and procedures, but of quiet, grim experience. This informal network, however, extends far beyond badged officers. The most critical intelligence often comes from sources entirely outside of any government structure. Long-term studies in rural sociology and anthropology have consistently shown that formal institutions are often the last to acquire deep-seated local knowledge. We are temporary custodians of the land. Others have a relationship with it that stretches back generations. The true rulebook for survival in these territories is held by tribal elders on the reservation that borders the park, or by the patriarch of a family that has been ranching the same valley since the territory was settled. Their knowledge is not superstition, it is an empirical database compiled over centuries of trial, error, and loss. A ranger who knows his business understands that a visit to a tribal council to ask about an old story is not a social call but a critical intelligence gathering mission. The elder won't speak of monsters, but they will tell you which canyons carry a bad wind in the autumn, or they will recount a tale of an ancestor who vanished after following a strange light. A story that, when cross-referenced with the Wardness Ledger, aligns perfectly with the geographic and seasonal patterns of modern disappearances. Similarly, a quiet conversation with a third-generation rancher might yield the simple advice to keep your people out of the high meadows after the first snow, no matter what. This is not a guess, it's a data-driven conclusion, a safety protocol paid for in blood generations ago. These channels operate on trust, not authority. And the information is the only thing that allows us to manage the cycles of appeasement effectively. Effective containment protocols are not self-contained within law enforcement, but are critically dependent on an undocumented network that integrates official authority with the generational land-based knowledge of local and indigenous communities. The public perception of law enforcement is conditioned to see an unsolved case as a professional failure, a loose thread in the fabric of civil order. But in these specific territories, the thick manila folder stamped open inactive is the highest form of success. It is not a record of defeat, it is an active instrument of containment, a carefully constructed bureaucratic shield. The lingering official ambiguity of the file serves a critical purpose that a closed report never could. It provides the permanent, unassailable justification for closing a trail, decommissioning a campsite, or declaring an entire sector off limits for environmental preservation or ongoing investigative activity. No budget committee will argue with a sheriff who needs to maintain a perimeter around the site of an active missing persons case. The open file is the ultimate expression of the doctrine of contained ignorance. Its unresolved status creates a zone of exclusion that protects the public far more effectively than any warning sign ever could. For those of us who know how to read the patterns, that file number, circulated in interagency memos, becomes a quiet signal, a modern-day cartographer's mark for here be dragons. It is a boundary marker left in the official record, signifying that the perimeter has been tested, the price has been paid, and the line has been reestablished. It confirms that the entity has been, for the moment, appeased, and that the cycle has receded back into a dormant phase. The open case is the closed border. An officially unsolved missing persons file is not an investigative failure, but a deliberate and successful containment strategy, using bureaucratic ambiguity to create a permanent shield that protects the public by restricting access to a known anomaly. Ultimately, the quiet stand-down triggered by certain incident report markers is not an admission of defeat, but the first act in a generations-old containment protocol. The incomplete public record is a necessary burden, a carefully maintained boundary map, where an unsolved case serves as the only safe and lasting warning to the living. This understanding reframes the very concept of justice in the wild, suggesting that sometimes the greatest service we can provide is not a final answer, but a lasting silence. If these perspectives are important to you, consider supporting the work we do here at Silent Whispers. With that in mind, I want to ask, where do you believe the ethical line falls between a family SS right to know and the collective S need for safety. Take care of yourselves. In our next briefing, we'll discuss the protocols for dealing with structures that appear where none should exist.